shadows in the distance. And we wanna go.
Hello everyone, this is SHADOWFOOT once again, and today we'll be working on my workbench. I kind of figured that this would be a decent mini-series to start, and here's going to be one of my first things I'm going to show you is this thing is called a floppy drive. And, you know, many people that watch this videos won't even know what one of these things are. But a floppy drive is kind of like, well, a lot of people probably don't even know what CDs are either. So it makes me feel kind of old that I actually knew what these were and I took them apart and, you know, yeah. In fact, I originally started learning at an extremely young age on like Tandies and Commodores and like taking apart computers and making family upset, and I always tend to crack into computers I weren't supposed to be into. Got suspended from school once for locking up all of the classroom computers by putting a BIOS password on one of them, or all of them, and they had to call in an IT specialist just to, you know, just get them unlocked so they're usable again. It was a pretty simple fix, but they didn't know how to fix it, so. But anyway, this is a floppy drive. Just like a DVD or a CD, this was not the first, but one of the early common adopters to how people transferred media from one device to another. I think the first was like a tape deck system of some kind, and then they came out with like a 8-inch, it was a 10-inch or 8-inch floppy, which are the black ones that are thin and, you know, really long and wobbly, like actually when floppy disks were floppy. And then some point this thing came out. They had something called a zip drive at one point, and zip drives were not popular enough to make it. But the floppy disks, if I remember correctly, could hold about 1.44 megabytes worth of data, and that's less than a common song today. But back then, and for the longest period of time, almost a decade, floppy disks were the primary method of getting data to and from one computer or another. Many games would run off this, and I could show like a image of a floppy disk, and it was basically a square that had a film on the inside similar to a vinyl record, and it would spin. So going through some of the components on here, you can't really see much on this side. This is the serial pin style connector that it used. This is the back end of a worm gear, and this is the power supply that it used, which I don't think I have one of those laying around. I have to look. Oh, yeah, I do. It's right under my phone. Alright, so on computer hardware, this is considered a Mullix connector, and it converts over to this old school power adapter right here, which plugs into the back of one of these. And that's how they got their power. Usually the two black ones are negative, and I think the red one is 5 volt and the yellow one's 12 volt. Could be wrong. That'd be the first time I've blew something by getting those two colors mixed up. But popping this thing open, kind of looks like a VCR in a way. You have the disc that comes in here, so your disc would go into this compartment and it would lock, and then you'd have this connector, or this little reader right here that would read the top and the bottom magnetics of the floppy disk. And just like a CD, it has this rotating disc right here that would rotate the floppy disk and be read. So it's a lot like how a CD works nowadays. Now this entire aperture that has the magnetic readers on it, you have to position it down a little bit. This little magnetic aperture could actually move back and forth to read everything, and this worm gear would be responsible for moving it back and forth. And it had to be precise enough, and it used actually physical tension in physics on how the worm gear is set up, because back then they didn't really have stepper motors that was cost efficient enough to use one of these, so they used approximation of the worm gear with where it's at on the track on the disc to get the closest approximation of, you know, where it is in relativity to on this. That's why you always hear a floppy disk worm gear tracking back and forth. They make a lot of noise because they don't know where they're at until they use some logic to figure that out. So that's basically the fundamentals of how this works here. And you know, this is very similar to how a record would work, except instead of a pin going across grooves, it's magnetic. And then back here you just have the basic circuit board. You have all your data pins here. You have your little logic board here that would take the data from the pins. You have this track right here on this side. If you look where all the leads go to, this one would go into the data distribution of how and where the disk actually gets its information. There should be a timing circuit here somewhere, because these old boards usually had a crystal in them so I could tell time, like a piezoelectric crystal. But anyway, I was going to take this thing apart and see what could be salvaged off this for later use. I've heard people use the worm gears and just having this plugged into a computer to make them into basic music boxes, because these things are usually over geared a lot and make a lot of noise, and people actually make the floppy drives sing and play music, so it's pretty cool. I'm going to start taking these apart. I do want the worm gear for maybe a later project. I'm not sure how many projects I could get out of it, but I figured this first video is going to be a introduction into some electronics that people's probably never heard of. I will start doing videos every now and then of taking apart electronics, and you know, it's actually the first time I've used a GoPro and on my head, so I'm not sure if it's even getting the right angle. But I'll continue taking this apart, and I'll take the parts and use them for some upcoming projects, since I have a bunch of these, and I have like an entire bin full of electronics I need to start breaking down and salvaging components off of. I think that's going to be in my next video, is showing how to salvage some basic components for later use, like for Arduinos and like Pi Zeros. Like most of this you can't really use. Like a lot of these are application specific. These little guys are so tiny that I don't have a proper workstation to even take off the SMDs off of these things, which that's what those little guys are. These little things, these are service mounted diodes, which basically work as a voltage regulation and a controller of sorts to limit the flow of voltage. But there's not much I can salvage off this. LED, worm gear, it's probably the main rotating disc part. I'm not even sure if the frame is worth salvaging. Oh, and a bunch of little screws. But just wanted to give you a little history lesson on some ancient technology that existed. I have a bunch of these as well. If anyone wants them, then they're more than welcome to come to Ohio and take them off my hands. Until next time, this is SHADOWFOOT signing out.
You liked that, didn't you? Well, there's more on Patreon. There'll be things that can only be seen by supporters. Go to patreon.com/ShadowDragon.
You can find a link to our Discord channel and more at our webpage at shadowfoot.net. Or you can just click down in the description below.
And don't forget to subscribe today.
Subscribe today.
Yeah, or something.